Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Harry. I'm Richard Reeves. As Ron said, I'm co-director of the Centre on Children and Families, which is hosting today's event. I'm just going to ask a few questions, and maybe there'll be a chance to extend some of the comments you weren't able to make. And then we'll bring on our panelists and then open it up more broadly. I'd like to add my welcome to those who are not only in the room, but those who are watching online. We have hundreds of people who are watching this via webcast, 50% of whom are currently wearing pajamas. You think you're just watching us. We're as grateful to you as to the people in the room. Well, not really, because they actually came, got dressed, showered, etc. First of all, I want to congratulate Sandy and Harry on this book. It is unusual in that it is three things. It's comprehensive, it's authoritative, and it's important. And it's relatively unusual to find a book that ticks all of those boxes. So thank you for your contribution to this field. It's going to be a book that I think a lot of us are going to be pulling off our shelves a lot and referring back to. So I think it's a really genuine contribution, so thank you. And I think the kind of broad story is that the system kind of works okay for people who are either reasonably affluent backgrounds and or reasonably well prepared. It is these disadvantaged students that it's not working. And it's in that spirit that I'm going to push you on a couple of points. I'm actually going to start, I think, with Sandy, this question that you wrestled with a bit, and it's running through your book. And I'll put it bluntly. It's the tension between tracking and openness to all futures. And that comes out in your section both on CTE in high schools and in this really interesting issue about what we're doing with those who enter community colleges and those debt figures and the returns figures, and your very strong story about getting a liberal arts or humanities qualification from community college not being the way to go. And here's what you say right towards the end of the book, which is one of your strongest lines, is you say that pointing people in less ambitious but more promising directions is the best way to improve their perspective. And it would quote, it is actually, quotes, irresponsible not to do so. You say it's irresponsible not to do so. And yet we don't want to be seen to be saying to, well, look, let's be honest, you're not really college material, okay? So why don't you do a vocational degree? But you look like college material. So yeah, you stay on that track. And that's a fundamental problem with any of these systems that try and promote the value of these alternative tracks. So I'm going to push you on it. How do you do that? How do you say to a kid, I'm really sorry, your GPA is not great, your preparation's not great, why don't you do a vocational degree? But that kid next to you, who's probably from a more affluent background, who may be more likely to be white, just because of the way things have come out, yeah, we think you're forward. How do we handle that tension?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. If I actually knew the answer to that question, it would be, I would be in a different place. But I do think that what we've done is err in the direction of not helping people to be realistic. So I was just reading an article this morning about in Wisconsin, they're requiring all high school students to do some sort of career training and so on and think about what they're most suited for. And there was tension in that article because they started saying, education, the purpose of it is just to get a job, and we should, and of course this is not true. Everyone should, and we talk about this in the CTE chapter, everyone should have a high school education that allows them to understand the way the world works, to learn something about what the work world is like. It's not going to hurt anybody who's going to go off to an elite college to have spent some time in a workplace learning about the work environment that most people face. So I think that that's one thing, is that we have to combine that for everyone. But the reality is, I can't avoid the question of at what point can you say to somebody, for you it's probably not going to work out. Yeah. And it's one thing to say, you have to do this, you cannot do something else. It's another thing to make sure that people have all the information they need and understand what happens to most people who have their characteristics if they go a certain direction. Because no matter what you do, you're closing off doors. And we ignore the fact that when students go and, if they have a 3% chance of earning a bachelor's degree and they go off to either study liberal arts at a community college thinking they're going to transfer, or they go to a 4-year, and the vast majority of them end up without that, they have closed doors. And we don't think of it as closing doors. So we need to think about those options as closing doors. We need better guidance, better realism. We have to acknowledge that by the time you're 18 or 20 or 25, you are in different circumstances and that it might not be your fault and it might not be because of your innate characteristics. I think we have to be tough about it a little bit.
So at some point you have to start getting more realistic, and you think 18 is appropriate. I mean, in Germany they do it at 12.
You know, so. I mean, I think I don't want to tell anybody they can't do this. If you get accepted to a college, you can go. I just want them to be able to make more informed decisions.
Sandy said that everything all of which I agree. This whole issue of tracking, which is why we let voc ed languish for so many years in subject improvement. Now it has drifted up to the community college level. I spoke to the provost of one of the largest community colleges in the country. He said, my students don't want to be technicians, they want to be professionals. And then if you look at the characteristics of that student body, the vast majority of them are nowhere near have the credentials, the academic background that's going to enable them. Now again, there's a difference between providing guidance and telling them what to do. You want to try not to cross that line. And the other thing is, again, that you want a range of pathways. So there's even students going to community college who get stuck in remediation and never leave remediation because they can't pass, and we think remediation needs a lot of reform. At the same time, there ought to be other pathways accessible to them. Some, in the certificate space especially, some for credit, some not for credit, but a range of pathways at which people can still do well if they come to the conclusion that the most academic pathway is not going to be successful.
Well, I'm going to build on that because all of your figures, many of which you've shown, for the outcomes of those from community colleges who aren't very well prepared, lead you to what you describe as a troubling question. And when you're reading a book as careful as this, and when you say a troubling question, you immediately start reading more carefully. And the troubling question is open admissions to community colleges. And you square the circle but I read it as saying, actually, we should rethink that idea, and we should think about having admissions requirements, but only when there are good alternatives in place. So it seems like a sensible position. But I'd like to hear more about that, because there is a strong case, given what you've just said, to rethink the idea of open admissions, even now, and that might force the creation of alternatives. And I also want to push on whether you entirely agree about that, and whether you're in exactly the same place on the question of open admissions. Maybe you do, but if not, I'll find something else to get you to disagree.
Well, I mean, look, community colleges serve an incredibly important function. And the idea that if you didn't do well in high school, you can't go to college is a terrible idea in the context of our society. So, of course, we should have options for people people grow up, people change, people have all kinds of things that we need to make sure. So I don't think that either of us intends to say, let's start having test score requirements for getting into community colleges. That said, if you look at the for-profit sector and think about this a little bit, there was a point in time when some for-profit institutions were being accused of going to homeless shelters and recruiting people to sign on the dotted line and pay, and actually with the threat of regulation, more for-profit institutions have started doing things like saying you have a test period of a few weeks before you pay tuition and before you become a registered student. So what those institutions are saying is we recognize that there are some students who have such a low probability of succeeding that it is really exploitive to have them sign on the dotted line and pay this tuition. And so I think we can see it in that sector. So then think about that in the community college sector. And think about, it doesn't mean you can't come here and take classes. And if we can have people taking classes without paying for them and without, closing off other avenues of their life, there are probably ways that we can manage to say there are things that you need to do before you borrow money, before you quit your job, before you change your life and put all your hopes in that basket. And so I think that's different from saying leave open admissions exactly as it is or narrow it. Doesn't mean turn people away. It means create options that recognize the chances that they have and where they can best succeed.
And sorry, we're not going to disagree on this either.
I've got something else.
Okay. These alternatives would probably be in the certificate space for people to come. If you come to community college, let's say out of the bottom quintile or bottom decile of your high school class, and they immediately shunt you off into developmental aid, your odds are low of actually getting an associate degree, but there are these certificate programs, again, some for credit, some not for credit, some of them actually stack to associates. So instead of closing the doors, it would be creating these alternatives which have good market value and at which some students at least might be a lot more successful.
Well, you've again teed up the next question, which is about for-profits. You identified two main problems, a completion problem and a value problem. And it seems to me that in profits you have both of those problems. You have horrible, and maybe a debt problem. So if you've got those three problems, and if you want to see where they're all at their worst, you see it in for-profits. And you strongly endorse regulation and continuing with the push there's been around regulation. But given everything that's in this book, the shorthand I've got for those now is that they're essentially expensive, subsidized failure factories. And the amount of public money that is being spent on these expensive failure factories may call for more than just more regulation. It's unthinkable, I think, that in another field of public policy, say Medicaid spending or something, that we would allow public dollars to go to institutions that are failing as spectacularly as many of these. Isn't it time? I'm not saying this is politically realistic right now. We should defend what we've got, but I want to push you a bit on that. Isn't there a case for being more aggressive? Isn't there a case for questioning public dollars through loan subsidies or Pell Grants and so on, going to institutions that are so consistently failing the students they serve?
Absolutely. Let me first do the qualification part of it, though. There are public and private nonprofit institutions that don't serve students any better than the average for-profit institution, and the same point you're making applies to those institutions. We should not be supporting students with federal funds to go to institutions that don't serve the vast majority of their students well. There are some for-profit institutions that do very well, and in fact, the completion rate for certificate programs is higher at for-profit institutions. They do a very good job of some things. If you want a short-term certificate and you know exactly what you're doing, and they will guide you through it, and whether they have value or not is another question, but they have higher completion rates for the 2-year. They give mostly certificates, whereas community colleges give more associate degrees. So I just want to make sure we don't paint just with such a broad brush. There should absolutely be stricter regulations. It is outrageous that we're looking at the debt problem, and such a huge percentage of the debt problem is that we say, here, take our federal dollars, go off to this institution where we know it's going to be a disaster, but don't worry, we're going to try to forgive your loans afterwards. That's not the solution.
There's one advantage of the for-profits, I think. And again, Sandy got it all right. But they are more agile in their responsiveness to sort of shifts in the labor market because they're much less bureaucratic. You don't have to get the faculty buy-in and a lot of the things at public institutions. So that agility, I think, helps their certificate programs quickly respond and quickly deliver. Having said all that, you look at the prices they're charging relative to the degrees, that does justify a lot of skepticism at the same time. So I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We want to keep these institutions and their quick market responses, but again, probably more regulation is needed to prevent the really bad outcomes that we do see in the overall numbers.
One of your specific policy recommendations is extending financial aid to those who are studying for certificates, which they don't always get, if I understand correctly. What's the argument against that? That seems, based on your data, and particularly that chart you showed on returns, to be a no-brainer. If anything, you'd be questioning financial aid for people doing liberal arts associates degrees rather than those who are doing certificates. You'd flip it if you're going to do it. I'm not going to ask you whether you would take financial aid away. I've already pushed you hard enough on that. But what's the argument against extending financial aid to certificates? What's the reasonable argument against that you've encountered?
First of all, it's not certificates; it's non-credit programs, right? So it's and if you go to a community college, at many community colleges, it's sort of an arbitrary distinction which ones are for credit and which ones are not. Yeah. So we're sort of making an arbitrary distinction in who gets it and who doesn't. The argument, so it should be more flexible. The argument against it is, we should have learned a lesson from what's happened with student aid in the for-profit sector, that you open up the student aid system to for-profit institutions and they will find ways to exploit it and get as much money as possible. And if you are too loose about non-credit programs or alternative programs or boot camp, whatever it is, and you just say, if you do something good, we're going to give you federal aid, you just watch and see what's going to happen to for-profit companies who engage in this. We have to be very careful about it.
So this is a place where I'm a little more sympathetic to that argument, because in the workforce development world, this is an argument that a lot of people do want to see. So allow people to use Pell Grants to get even not for credit credentials that the labor market values. So I think it's worth at least experimenting with. Having said that, the downside is scary. And what everyone says in this field is, well, they'd have to be industry-recognized credentials. Well, how do you know if they're industry-recognized? At the end of the day, you look at the data on what the market return is. But as many of us in this room know, there's a lot of things you can do with data to sort of misrepresent results and to present them. So it's not as clear-cut a test as you might think. So I am in favor of that experiment. And of course, the other thing is we know that given the political power of some of these private interests, like in the for-profit schools, you can see them with any, if you open the door a little bit, there's at least the possibility of these places barreling in and opening the floodgates. So I think Sandy and I end up with, we want to try this, we want to experiment with it, we want to evaluate it before we embrace it wholeheartedly, but be aware of the pluses as well as the potential downside.
One of the things you mentioned, Harry, was the gap in resources that are available to community colleges versus four-year colleges. And you point out that it's hard to compare exactly because they're different kinds of institutions, but nonetheless the gap is so great, that it's hard to imagine that there isn't an unfair differential, and that's what you say. You quote the Century Foundation report on this, which called pretty strongly for Title X type funding. Am I getting that right? Yes. Oh, so with Title I funding? Yes, thank you. I always get that mixed up. Thank you, David. Title I funding for community colleges. You pull it back a little bit from that. You don't go quite as far as them. You make the point that there's a resource issue. Do you think that there should be a move to specifically devote more resources to community colleges? And if you had to do that in a relatively revenue-neutral way within the sector as a whole, where would you get the money from?
Well, okay. All of us would prefer a world where the resources were greater, right? So it wouldn't be coming out of someone else's pocket in higher ed. And some of our friends a few blocks away in One DuPont Circle, not your organization, would certainly object to a scheme where total spending is constant and you're reallocating. Now, if we had better incentives on spending the money, I mean, huge amounts of money are being wasted, public and private money, among people who don't finish anything. So one thing you can imagine that if there was a more rational reallocation of that money, completion rates would go up, and a lot of the money there would be better spent, and that wouldn't call for new resources. Having said that, new resources are a problem. I have called for something like a race to the top for higher ed, for public higher ed, where the federal government would inject some new resources into the system with strong accountability attached to it and very targeted. That would be my first choice. My sense right now is that the feds aren't dying to throw more money into anything like this, so we still will face the trade-offs. But
I'm going to just push you a little bit more on that. We are sitting here, we're doing a deal. I'm in the White House. And I'm saying, okay, I buy it. We do need to give more money to community colleges, and a lot of people will do better from that. But I need the CBO to score it in such a way that it's not going to add to the deficit. And I want you to find the money from within that broad sector. You've written a whole book which says we're wasting billions of dollars. Find me a way now, not based on future behavior changes and incentives, but right now. And if you can't, and if you don't want to do that deal, no deal.
So part of the problem is in the way they score things. So if I don't get to change the scoring system, that's hard. Because like in the student loan system, there are places where we could absolutely save money, but because of the way the student loans are scored, it looks like we wouldn't save money. So because we're spending a lot of money now on student loans that don't get repaid or that go to people who are going to be doctors and lawyers and so on, that we don't need to do. I think, I don't think that most research universities or most four-year colleges are overfunded, but there may be ways other sources of revenue are much more available to research universities and to selective four-year institutions than to community colleges. They can't raise tuition, they're not going to be good at fundraising, their graduates aren't rich. So we need to think about how to expand that base. But we also need to think about how to use the money. There's a great new study from Dave Deming at Harvard who points out that who finds that if you have $1,000, if you put it into the institution to improve student services, it will have a significant impact on completion rates. If you use it to reduce tuition, it won't. So right now, what are we doing? We're just trying to cut tuition. Maybe we shouldn't cut tuition for everyone.
Okay. I have some ideas where we could get the money, but I'm not the one that's really. Maybe subsidies for endowments, tax subsidies for the huge endowments.
Let's have that conversation another day.
All right. I'm going to ask LaShawn and David to come up and mic themselves up. LaShawn's going to speak first, but just while they're settling, and very briefly, was there anything you disagreed about as you were writing the book? And if so, what did you learn from the disagreement? And don't say you didn't disagree about anything.
We did.
It's not possible.
We did.
I think on the workforce side, I was more sympathetic to this notion of at least trying the financial aid in the non-credit space. I think Standy always came to that with greater skepticism. I think I saw the upside more of that. So I think that might be one area. And I think I was always more positive on the accountability schemes.
On the performance-based funding, you were more positive, and
right.
I was more skeptical.
Right. Although, again, both of us recognize the downside as well as the upside, and a lot of it simply depends on how you do it and avoiding the pitfalls.
Yeah. So I would say we had differences of opinion, but it was more like they weren't great. And we learned a lot from each other, which was a great part of writing this book.
You can tell. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn to our two panelists now, who each have 8 minutes to respond, and then we'll open it up again for discussion. LaShawn, I think you're first.
Yep, great. So I thought this book did a really great job of meeting its goal of trying to mesh academics and policy making together. Really written to translate what the research has found to policymakers who need to make decisions right away. And oftentimes when you are in the position of needing to make policy, the evidence that you need to base that on is not readily available. So having something that tries to synthesize and move beyond sort of the we need more research is a great contribution to the field. So I have 3 comments on the book specifically. One is about what works best for whom. The second is about details. So the devil is in the details in terms of refining solutions. And then my last comment is about equity of opportunity and outcomes. So in terms of what works best for Hume, I think the book does a really good job of laying out describing who the student body is, because oftentimes folks who are not vested in post-secondary research tend to think about the traditional college student as being the average student. But really, independent students or non-traditional students are now surpassing our typical 18-year-old going to college. But yet, most policy and most research is based on that what's going to be a smaller demographic of students who are coming out of high school going directly to college. This is really important because many of the solutions in the book, and it's not just the book, it's actually the research field, many of the solutions are geared towards traditional students. So if it's the case that older students, non-traditional students, students who have families themselves that they're supporting is growing in population, what works best for those students? So we're talking about financial aid, student loans, et cetera, institutional supports. Think about the demographic for which you are working primarily and you're a student second. Some of those solutions are not readily applicable. I would also add that the book, while it focuses on disadvantaged students and low-income students, there's a lot of variation in that population. So in addition to the independent students, there are different patterns of success for students of color. Within the minority population, there are different patterns of success among, say, African-American males, Native American males, Latino males, and the book does not get into that level of specificity, but it's important to realize that because, as both Sandy and made this point earlier, that there is not one silver bullet. There's not one solution. And so when you start to think about policy, it's important to think about the heterogeneity in the population because low-income students in general, there might be some solutions that may be more applicable if you're working with a population of disadvantaged males from low-income areas versus not. Finally, I think about this issue of what works best for whom in a stock and flow type analysis. So by that, what I mean is right now we are in a world for which there's this population proportion of independent students versus traditional students. But as we start to look out 10, 15, 20 years from now, how do we think these changes are going to manifest? If I had to guess, I would say that given that folks are having fewer children, the average number of children per family is declining, a number of factors that increases the incentives for folks going back to school and earning certificates and teching up their skills, that we're going to have more of this situation of people going back to school, trying to get incentives, trying to increase their salaries. And given that that's the case, how do we think about the policies and recommendations we're making now and the research that needs to be conducted so that there are findings 5, 10 years from now that's going to be able to speak to these problems? The book doesn't spend a lot of time on that, obviously, but I think that those are really important because as researchers, it's important for us to think ahead about what needs to be available in order for policymakers to make decisions later. In terms of the devils being in the details, the book does a wonderful job of summarizing the evidence base out in the world right now about what can work. There are a number of programs and solutions that have gotten a lot of publicity, such as CUNY's ASAP programs, and the guided pathways idea is growing in popularity. It makes a lot of sense, the guided pathways procedures when you just think about it. However, it's really important to think about the details for this, because these are not solutions for which a stroke of the pen is going to implement them with fidelity. ASAP, for example, most people will focus on the cost of it as being the barrier, but I would counter that the cost of ASAP is just one of two major barriers to getting it implemented and accomplished widespread in different institutions. There's a student-facing part of ASAP that's about fidelity and really close and tight integration. And when you're at a public institution for which you need buy-in of your faculty and you need engagement on multiple levels of departments, that becomes difficult. Not only that, there's a part of ASAP that is about what I think about as the back office functions, of having the administration being able to say, you will do this, we will use those services this way, you will provide these wraparound services, it will happen like this. That's a fidelity of implementation problem that has a multifaceted construction in order for it to occur. And thinking about how to make that happen on a broad scale is really difficult. And so, moving on, given that I'm about to be cut off, I think my last point is this point that we've been grappling with, which is equity of opportunity as well as outcomes. And so I really struggle with this idea of making it clear that you are less likely to be successful in an area given your past performance. There's loads of history about tracking in this country. There's loads of research that suggests that there are inequitable treatment of students on the basis of color and income. And those things are happening at kindergarten. So if we're suspending students, if the rate of suspension of students in kindergarten is correlated by race and income, what is the likelihood that you go through that system through high school and all of a sudden it disappears on the cusp of going to college? I find that incredibly unlikely. And so in our country, I think we struggle with this in different ways than Germany and Europe. And I don't think there's a quick solution to overcoming it. And I think our intentions can be pure, but as we all know, it's the execution and the implementation that matters.
Thank you, Michelle. David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Harry and Sandy, for your book, which I do think is comprehensive and authoritative, as Richard said earlier. I wanted to just respond to a few things that have been said previously in this morning's panel, which, of course, has covered a lot of ground, and then talk a little bit about what my organization thinks the federal and state governments might do as a way of addressing some of the problems and challenges that we've talked about this morning. First thing, though, I'd like to say is that, as we're all aware, I just want to reiterate the fact that it remains the case, and unfortunately is becoming even more pronounced, that it is the lower income students and individuals of this country are going to the less well-resourced institutions, meaning for-profit institutions and community colleges. Richard asked a tough question a moment ago about subsidies, what we would do with the pie that wasn't expanding and how we would move those around. And I'm glad you asked that to the first presenters rather than myself. But I think
I'm going to ask you too.
Well, there's your answer. But I think it does need to be restated, even though it doesn't change anything, that the community colleges have by far the fewest researchers stipulating the complexities of measurement to serve the students who have the most challenges in succeeding in post-secondary education. And just to give that a little bit of grain for you all, the average community college faculty member, an associate level, so they're teaching 5 courses a semester for 2 semesters, gets paid $66,000 a year, the average associate faculty member. Another thing that I think is important is that when community college budgets are cut, they lay off people. They may not be the most efficiently structured entities that's ever been created, but there is so little margin and so little reserves that funding is cut and heads roll essentially within the institution. So that's the reality that the colleges are facing. Talked a little bit about accountability. I differ just a tiny bit with Harry there to the extent that I think that our institutions are in fact under a large amount of accountability. They're publicly funded, and they have boards of trustees at the state or local level, sometimes both. And the oversight may not be what it might be, but when the piper is providing money for you, the institutions and the leaders are very much in the spotlight and called to question in terms of the performance of the institutions. I would contrast that with for-profit institutions where, although there is some state oversight, essentially the gate allowing the for-profit institutions to receive Title IV funding, which of course approaches 90% in many of those cases, is accreditation, which was created by the for-profit sector to accredit institutions to participate in Title IV. And we posit that as a fundamental difference between for-profit institutions and public community colleges, all other differences notwithstanding. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the solutions and some of the things that we would like to see done with just a little bit more in the way of resources to help our institutions be more effective. And I think the book does an excellent job of pointing out the many things that community colleges are presently doing to try to become more successful. Guided pathways, overhaul of developmental education, much more work with data both inside the institution itself and in working with labor markets. Early intervention, working with high school, as Harry pointed out. Lots of exciting things are being done. And if there's one thing that drives me batty, it's the claim that community colleges and even higher education, I'll defend my colleagues there, are resting on their laurels. I think it's absolutely untrue. They are innovators in all sorts of ways. We may be the leading sector in that regard, but colleges are changing very much. You see it across all sectors. So moving on finally to what we think the government ought to be doing in terms of helping community colleges, both students and institutions, as this book covers. The Pell Grant program, about 38% of all community college students receive a Pell Grant. The grant is $6,020 with a little bit of luck starting next July, $5,920. Currently, it needs to continue increasing. We talked a moment ago about funding for short-term certificate programs. The Higher Education Act does not fund certificates shorter than 16 credit hours. So if you're 600 hours or 15 weeks or shorter, equivalent, you're not funded. We believe that funding should be provided. We also believe the Lifetime Learning Credit, which was created in 1997 in the Tax Budget Balanced Act, should be restructured somewhat, or at least examined by Congress to provide real funding for short-term training. The money is essentially directed primarily to graduate and professional students to the tune of $2,000 a year, and very much difficult to access for our short-term students and non-credit students. We believe that the federal government needs to provide better data. We need a unit record data system desperately. It's going to be a challenge for us to get Congress to do that, but we think it is irresponsible that we don't have one, and that it should be key to labor market earnings for reasons I think everybody here would understand. We need to know what happens to program graduates, whatever we might do with that information, and however it might be utilized by students and institutions. And then at the state level, we think that articulation between 2-year and 4-year colleges in some cases needs to be force-fed to the institutions so that there is more effective movement on, particularly in light of the information that's come out this morning about the AA programs and the lack of economic return. For many of those students need to go on to 4-year institutions. Institutions themselves can cooperate more effectively. Community colleges are truly local, but a lot of workforce policy needs to be done at a regional level. The TAC program that was created in 2010 forced colleges in some cases to work together at the state level, had many good results. We have some good data emerging on that. And then finally, the state student financial aid programs have been historically created for students attending 4-year colleges. They don't work real well for a lot of community college students, particularly students who simply apply late and for a fixed pot of money, and they apply in the summertime and the money's run out and they don't get the funds. Or short-term programs are also in some cases ineligible, so we'd like to fix that. And thank you again for having me here.
Thank you, David and LaShawn. I'm just going to facilitate a quick exchange, I think, before we go out. Let's drill into a couple of those questions and ask Sandy and Harry to respond. But obviously, there may be other things you want to respond to, too. LaShawn's point about drilling down by race and gender into some of this stuff, which you do a bit of, and actually the completion rates for different races do jump out. So at public 2 years, the percentage getting any credentials, people starting at public 2 years, for whites is 29%, but for black and Hispanic Americans it's 20 and 21%, so there's a gap there, and there's a smaller gender gap too. But if you think about the specific issues that are faced, say, by young men of color, and particularly young black men, and these institutions, can you say a little bit more about how either your findings or your solutions would be differently framed through a racial lens as opposed to an income lens?
So first of all, I want to thank the discussants. Those were both great comments, so thank you. On the racial lens per se, so it is true that if you control for achievement differences, those gaps narrow a lot. Maybe not completely, but quite a bit. That's actually less true for the gaps based by class as opposed to race. But I think, lower income men in general, black or white, I think these workforce programs are very important to them. And again, we're generalizing hugely here, but I think here the liberal arts AAs are going to serve them less well. We have evidence, for instance, that young men tend to do better in workforce programs that are things like apprenticeship, career academies, things of that nature. So I think strengthening those approaches, strengthening the work-based learning options, I think would be one useful thing for the racial lens. The other thing, LaShawn mentioned earlier that she didn't think we paid quite enough attention to the non-traditional students, the older students in our
solutions.
In the solutions.
Yeah.
That's probably true. They are different, and they do have different needs. In the book, we do talk about, for instance, trying to get people information before they decide which institution to go to, and that's even because the labor market information is even more important. Since that group is almost always looking to enhance their earnings rather than just get a liberal arts AA or BA. Getting them information, in an earlier report that Sandy talked about in Pell Grants, we actually talked about possibly requiring every student in that population to enter a one-stop. We have 3,000 one-stops across the country funded by the Labor Department. The vast majority of community college students, to our knowledge, never set foot in one. They exist for the purpose of trying to help people figure out what skill enhancement they need to get good paying jobs. So that's one, and I think the work-based learning models also for that group are very important, and also the services that help people with young children access. All those things are probably relatively more important for that population than for younger ones. So they are in the book, but we probably should have highlighted them a little more.
Yeah, I would just say that, like, looking at the differences among subgroups, demographic subgroups, and obviously in a book that is trying to cover this broad topic, we can't talk about the difference between, you look at Hispanic students and the difference between native-born and immigrants and from Mexico and from, these are really important questions that our book doesn't deal with. It also, the question of community colleges, they're very different demographic groups. They're urban and rural and predominantly white, and some are more middle income. So every institution in trying to implement solutions has to look at its population, and I don't think we pretend that we could give that kind of advice to individual institutions or groups.
When you overlap gender and race, isn't it the case, and it's a genuine question, that there is quite a big difference in the trajectories around college completion and attainment between black women and black men, that actually you're seeing an improving trend among black women, us and the whole panel is among black women. There's still a big race gap, but the trend for black men is much, much worse. A, is that true? And B, does that alter your answer in any way? Or would you simply say, well, those low-income black men will be helped by these general policies aimed at the low income anyway? Or do you think there are more? And Harry, you've done a lot of work, for example, on the impact of prior incarceration and the distance from the labour market and what effect that might have. And in fact, if you've got some offences, I don't think you're even eligible for financial aid. Is that playing in here, for example, around some of the race gaps?
It might be, but in fact, that gap is also growing wider and wider in all of the racial groups. And so, the numbers for lower income or working class white men, not just in community college, but almost everywhere in society, are looking really bad. So I think, yes, there's some issues like incarceration that's very unique, really overwhelmingly hurts black men more than anyone else. And we should think about, those students, if they can meet the achievement hurdles, they need a lot more help, and they certainly shouldn't be penalizing them for past. Yeah. So in terms of in terms of financial aid and other supports, those kinds of things we probably could target. But there is this problem of men in general, and again, I do think the workforce and the occupational associate programs are the ones that work best for them.
Okay, I'm going to pick up one of David's points and then come back to this issue. I'm just decided not to call tracking. Identification, selection, whatever we're going to. I think we do need to come back to that. But David offered a defence. Tell me if I get this wrong. A kind of defence of the community college sector against the idea that it needs tighter regulation, race to the top, tighter accountability mechanisms that you call for quite strongly, and has argued that actually they're pretty innovative. The accountability structures are already quite strong, given that they're public institutions anyway, and that actually that isn't where the problem is around accountability. Is that a fair summary of your defence?
Yes, that's a fair summary of my defense of the way we conceive of the sector, but I just want to add that we do believe that better information, comprehensive, systematic, national information about the performance of institutions is badly needed, and that a lot of the debates that we have about the effectiveness of institutions would dissolve if that information were out on the table and we could make legitimate comparisons. Because I think we get to the for-profit issue, despite all of the criticism that they've had, we saw some data this morning, is that we still don't know a lot of the educational outcomes of the institutions, particularly in terms of the workforce.
So you think that more information might do some of that work anyway to incentivize improvements. My guess is that the evidence from college score from various attempts in this direction is that it's been mixed in terms of its impact on incentives. But what's your response? What's your response to the defense?
I think we are setting an impossible task for community colleges, right? We are asking community colleges to take every person who comes there with any background for any reason and offer many different types of programs. Many of the programs in community colleges you really couldn't call college. I mean, is English as a second language college? What is college? And we're asking them to be successful on a large scale in all of these ways. And I think they can be very innovative and resourceful and talented and everything else and still not succeed in meeting all of those goals. But the problem of when you're in a situation when you have to say, well, okay, only 20% of the students who walk through our door ever emerge with their credential, or 30%, or we don't know exactly what the percentage is, but given our circumstances, that's great. It's not great, and obviously, if for 70% of the students it's a bad outcome, then that means we need other solutions, and I don't think community colleges internally can find those solutions on their own. It's a big social problem, but I'm not willing to say they're doing their best, so let's not worry about those 70% of the students.
Let's go to one more, and then we're about to come out to the audience, so please be ready with your questions, be ready to raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you. But back again, I think LaShawn started with this, the issue of the fear that an approach which identifies an appropriate pathway earlier for certain people, given the history of tracking in the US, understandably causes concern. I come to this as a new American, and I've learned that this is a much hotter button issue than it is elsewhere. In Germany, they track at 12, and they have fantastic vocational, and there's a lot of people over there arguing that that's a problem, that you're identifying too early. Certainly in most countries, the idea that you wouldn't start thinking at 18 that you're going to start finding more appropriate pathways is completely uncontroversial. It remains controversial here, partly because of this kind of historical issue. And so I think if I framed your anxiety correctly, it's that in practice, what that happens on the ground is that you look at certain people and go, well, you base it on certain presumptions about their background, what school they went to, their race, maybe their gender, and you say, yeah, I think shop for you, right? And vocational education is almost always for other people's children, right? So one of the things that always strikes me about this debate is that when we're talking about the value of these things, we are very rarely thinking about our own children. We're putting our own children through four-year colleges. And so that sense that it's always for other people's children and that those other children may be disproportionately of color creates this strong reaction, which I think you're kind of seeing, which is that in practice it will replicate racial inequality and income inequality and maybe gender inequality, even if you set out in theory. On the other hand, the idea that we're just never going to say to people, maybe four-year college isn't for you, given where you're from, is maybe hurting the very people who we most need to help. We have one more round on this.
I agree with you. And that's not what we mean to be suggesting, because if you say to somebody, you have to do this and you can't do that, that's tracking them into one path. And I don't think we're suggesting that at all. What we're saying is we need to expose students to more different kinds of pathways and opportunities, and we need to create those pathways and make them productive pathways. Not we need to say to people, your third grade test score wasn't high enough, you have to go this way. Let me just say, we track people dramatically when they're 18 years old, right?
Yeah.
We say you get into a selective college and you don't, and your only option is a community college, and we do that. And at some point, some people transfer from a community college to a highly selective four-year institution. So we don't close the door totally, but we do make it very challenging. But obviously we acknowledge that at some point, and that system could be modified, but we are saying you have to pursue this pathway. I didn't study pre-med, and if I wanted to go to medical school, I was going to have to go back and do some really big things in order to open that pathway to myself. Nobody told me I can't, but I'm looking at it, and I realize it would be really hard for me to do that now. So I think we have to help people understand better what their options are. We have to create better options. We don't have good options now for people who are not doing well academically, and we need to create those options, and we need to encourage multiple options. And you know what? We close the door to upper middle class students on vocational education because we say that's not good enough. If we had a society where we had more respect for different kinds of occupations and different pathways, we would open doors for people who now have to go this way because their parents expect
That's right. So the best models of high-quality career in tech ed in high school get away from that old-fashioned that it's either or. That if you're in CT, it's only those. The best career academies, lots of kids in college prep backgrounds are in the career academies doing some studies of healthcare while they're taking AP classes in English Lit. Right? There's no reason why it has to have such a rigid, and that's the model to try to reduce the segregation of and you try to. The notion is that in some places that everybody would take at least some career-enhancing classes, so you reduce the stigma associated with that, and you try to offer more blended models. So you don't have to make this choice one or the other. And of course, the other thing that I would say is that in our recommendations, we did talk about this idea that if people have low achievement and they're going to be assigned to, let's say, developmental ed, let's identify that earlier. So in the 9th grade, there's no reason why in the 9th grade we can't tell people, you want to go to college? You know what? These scores that you have, these majors in math and science, they have to be. And instead of saying, you can't go, you better think of shop class, you try to target resources for them to actually try to improve their outcomes. So that would be a way of trying to counteract the disadvantages that LaShawn correctly pointed out, rather than just slamming doors in people's faces who are in that situation.
Let's ask about this question, respect. I think one of you just used that, and you used that word in here actually about CTE at high school, but I want to invite all the panelists to respond to this and talk about, you've used the word stigma as well. Let's just say reputation. So there are certain tracks, certain pathways, I should say, certain institutions, certain subject matter which have a particular stigma or something associated with them, right? So when I said voc ed is for other people's kids, that is because those who are in a position who are under that system think that it's lower quality, lower admission standards, and lower value in the labor market, right? And so we are not seriously thinking about those as options for our own kids, particularly when we see all the charts that you kind of put up. And it's partly because, and I'm thinking about it, so I have a high school senior, and one of his options is our local community college, which is fantastic. It's Montgomery College, so we're in a good position, right? And it's quite clear that when you think about it's a good track, it gives you, it's a good way to go, lots of options. But in the kind of, among their classmates and so on, there's no question that even at that age, it's attached to a certain, it's attached to a sense of, oh dear. I'm going to community college, oh, what happened? Right? It's almost like you're telling someone you've had some sort of accident, you're going to hospital or something like that. It does, within certain class circles, it does have that stigma. And you say, we need to increase the respect of CTE, of community college, see it as an option for more people, not just for those who have, quotes, failed, but for others. how do we do that? I mean, I'm asking David, LaShawn, I'm asking all of you, because it seems to me that all the policy ideas in the world aren't going to make much traction if we continue to have this mental geography of the system, which employers have, which parents have, and which students themselves have about what constitutes good in the system. How do we actually address that? And are there examples of community colleges or CT that have successfully done that and drawn in broader? So let's start with you, David, as your community college.
I do think it starts, before the collegiate level, for sure, in most cases. There are many high school programs, particularly I know in the South, that have provided technical education programs that feed directly into the community colleges. Salt Lake has one in aeronautics. So it gives people a sense that they can get a good job if they study in a specific field starting at the high school level. I think this is obviously a tremendously complicated issue in terms of people's aspirations, their level of educational preparation, their family, cultural factors as well, and there really isn't a simple answer to it. But one thing that I do know is that for many students who do go to community college, who succeed, they find themselves much better off than they were when they started. And certainly they're better off financially than their parents were. And so you might say that it's, from the perspective of maybe most of the people sitting in this room, you don't want your child to go to the local community college because in some people's minds that has a stigma associated with it. But if you're a first-generation student or you're an immigrant and you go to Nova and you get in the nursing program, that's damn good for you, and that's real success. That's a real step forward for you and probably your children as well if you have them. And so I think that if we put the lens of people who have baccalaureate degrees look at community colleges, it might not be satisfactory to have your child have what, as it's been defined, and this Brookings Institution's done work on this too, a middle skills job. I mean, a middle skills job is by definition a job. It's a sub-baccalaureate credential that generally does not garner the same earnings as a baccalaureate holders receive, and yet it's much better than high school, and it's a lot better than nothing. So how you thread that needle, how you make it attractive to somebody who maybe isn't going to get into Harvard College, but has the wherewithal to succeed at a community college program, it's really difficult. And as I said at the start, it needs to begin early in the educational spectrum.
LaShawn, do you agree that stigma or reputation is an issue for some of these?
I completely agree. So I agree with David that it needs to start early, and I agree with Harry and Sandy that it needs to be available. I think one model that I'm really intrigued with is in New Jersey. New Jersey high schools have what's called academies. They're actually selective high schools. Mm-hmm. But with the selection, so this is clearly a college prep program, there's targeting of students who are eligible. You need to test in. But the one thing that they do is they all require some career focus. So it could be culinary, it could be mechanics, it could be auto mechanics. There's something that everyone is doing. And in that way, you start to change the parental focus of what it means to have CTE. It's now different. It's not voc ed, it's career enhancement. My kid is definitely going to college. And that perspective can trickle down. What really concerns me in all of the solutions is really about the execution. It's not so much the idea. I think the ideas are good, but once you send an idea out into the field, what you get often is poor fidelity to design. And how do you counter the implicit bias of administrators and teachers in executing that program? And then the manifestation is something that was not intended. That's really what I'm focused on.
Yeah, I'd like to invite you to reply, and then we'll go out.
I'll just say one thing. I have 3 daughters. 2 of them are still in high school. I would not mind if they were required to take some career-enhancing courses, certainly at a minimum. Career information, career learning, labor market information, but also, I mean, LaShawn is right. These academies, career academies, you can have top-notch students learning something about healthcare and getting some work experience in healthcare. And I don't think that's a bad experience. Now, there's always an opportunity cost, and what do you have to cut? But from that point of view, that it's always for someone else's kids. If we have a system where even our kids are getting some of this, then the stigma would fall, I think.
I totally agree with that, but I think David's point is really important about the difference in your expectations and where you're coming from. Given the inequality in our society now, we can't expect, if you think of an outcome like the outcome you just described of get a nursing degree at a community college, that is significant upward mobility for many people. It is downward mobility for other people. We have to acknowledge that that's the case. And we're not going to get parents to encourage their kids to go follow paths that represent to them downward mobility. So the solution is going to have to be much bigger than within the community colleges.
I think nursing is the most upwardly mobile profession, isn't it? In terms of of bringing people from poor backgrounds higher up the income distribution, nursing is.
But you would say to your kids, "Why don't you want to be a doctor?" So, how do we solve that problem?
Sure. Okay, I'm going to open it up now. There's appetite out there, I can tell. So let's start with this group here. The gentleman right at the back with the glasses there. Yeah, let's start with you. If you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, that would be great. And then when you come to the panel, I'm not going to ask all of you to answer all of the questions because the math, otherwise we have 48 questions very quickly. But let's start with you, sir.
Yeah, my name is David Hardy. I'm from Philadelphia. Just last week, the Pew Research Institute put out a study that showed that in Philadelphia, race is the most significant factor in people getting college preparatory educations in public high schools. We've talked about this topic, and it's certainly geared towards minority students. And it seems to me that we haven't talked about the schools that a lot of these children have to come from that don't prepare them for college. It isn't about they didn't do the work. We have people who are valedictorians who went to school all the time. They did all the work presented to them, but it wasn't enough for them to be successful in college. Unless we start talking about that, all this other stuff really means nothing. You're acting like the colleges get people all at the same level, and you're messing it up. That's not what's wrong. They get messed up long before they get to you, and nobody's saying something about it. So I hope we could talk about something like that.
We'll take a couple more, and I know that Sandy and Harold can talk about it because they do talk about them. But the lady in front of you.
Thanks. My name's Laurie Mack. I'm from International Baccalaureate. I'm wearing my IB blue today by accident. And the IB's newest program that we just finished some research on this year is called the Career-Related Program. And I was about to jump out of my seat the last 10 minutes or so because it sounds like it addresses a lot of what you all are talking about. It's built on the triad of employability, academic, and technical skills. It has 3 components, 2 or more IB courses, a CTE component, and then personal professional skills and a whole suite of other employability kinds of seminar courses, things like that. And we found that about 4 out of 5 of those kids went to college, of the sort of early adopters.
How many? Sorry, say that again.
4 out of 5, 81%.
Yeah.
That was the entire population, 2013 to 2015. 3/4 of them went to 4-year colleges, pretty traditional-looking college students in every way in that group. And about 1/4 went to 2-year colleges for their initial enrollment. And I was pretty excited to see that the most common major of those who had declared majors at 2-year colleges was liberal studies, general education, bachelor prep, that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, so it looks like they're planning to transfer to 4-year colleges afterwards. And now my eyes have been opened a little bit.
Did they? Do you know if they did?
No, it's just really, really early outcomes because it hasn't been around long enough, basically.
It would be good to know because that's obviously a very different outcome.
Ask me again in a couple of years. I'd be happy to find out. But the program hasn't been around long enough for us to see yet. But basically, my question is, with these students, they took IB courses in high school. They did college and career readiness kinds of coursework. And we saw that their 1-year retention rates in 2-year colleges were higher than the national average for 1-year retention rates for 4-year colleges. The persistence rate for the whole group is 89%. So really, really high persistence, which makes me think maybe these kids are the ones who will be served well by these liberal studies kinds of majors. But I don't know. I'm speculating, and I'm biased. Yeah. So my question is basically, are there ways for these liberal studies programs to serve students better, or maybe are there good examples of community colleges that are doing this really well? Because a study from National Student Clearinghouse that was recent that I remember showed that if a student finishes an associate's degree, transfers to a 4-year program, once they do that, they are just as likely to finish their bachelor's degree on time as somebody who's been in it the whole time. So I'm wondering, who are those liberal studies programs for? And are there examples of them working really well?
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think the gentleman right in front of you, and then we'll come to the panel. So,
Hi, I'm Frank Ballman with the National Association of State Student Grant Aid Programs. So a lot of states have data, say average starting salaries by school and by major, but we find not a lot of students are looking at that before making their decision. And then on the flip side, say Purdue has an income share agreement program that sends pretty clear market signals by saying less percentage of your income in shorter number of years in terms of what you should be majoring in maybe. What would your thoughts be on linking need-based aid to that sort of thing? As an example, if I was going to attend a school with a 10% graduation rate, and I'll focus on four-year schools. I know David's schools have different metrics that are relevant, but and then an 80% graduation rate, maybe a $8,000 Pell Grant's more appropriate because from the federal investment viewpoint, I'm getting the same rate of return on both those. And ultimately, as the federal investor, my goal should be I'm getting 25, 28, 31% of that student's earnings the rest of their life. That's a great investment.
Thank you. Okay, we'll come back to the panel now. Three questions are from David. It's happening at high school. I will say I think one of the virtues of this book is that you simultaneously recognize the existing inequalities, but don't let colleges off the hook. There's a tendency in this field for colleges to blame high schools to blame middle schools to blame elementary schools, and elementary schools to blame kindergartens, and kindergartens to blame parents. And then everyone gets off scot-free, whereas, of course, there's a bit of all of those, and I do think that's a virtue. But that's one. It's, you can't do any of this without solving high schools. The second is you're very down on liberal arts and humanities associates degrees, very. Are there circumstances in which that's good, other than just a transfer, can be saved? And then this question about, I guess it's skin in the game, but it's also a bit more accountability. If we're going to spend this money on needs-based aid, let's spend more of it at the institutions that are doing better and use it to incentivize practice. So let's come to our authors first. Perhaps we'll start with you, Harry, as we start this.
Okay, so the first gentleman who talked a lot about high school, you're obviously right. And we do talk about reaching back into the high school, during high schools, whether it's dual enrollment programs or these programs that identify the gaps and try to, so it's not like we're just saying that's fine or that's given. However, at the end of the day, you still have this large chunk of people going off to college, community college especially, not prepared, right? So you have to take as given that that's going to be the reality, and given that reality, what are the best ways to address it? So it's not either or, and we certainly endorse doing more of that thing. But we do have to deal with the reality of what happens when people do get to post-secondary. So the question of, are there times when liberal arts, I think liberal arts within a framework, like a guided pathways framework, where people start, everybody starts broad, and then the structure kind of forces them gradually to narrow. They have much more information when they make those choices, and so the choices are better. That's a sense, within that framework, liberal arts is not as bad. And again, we're not saying nobody should take liberal arts if they're never going to transfer, just recognizing that the pendulum has swung too far in that direction, and people need, and what's interesting when I thought about this, other things I've written recently on the automation problem and the fear of robots replacing everybody, it's clear that what everybody agrees on is one of the solutions to that is to give people a broad skill set and a broad, cognitive skill sets, right? So if they face these, and liberal arts does that too. It's just trying to find that right balance, and to have people, again, they start with that, but to have a structure where gradually they have to make tougher and tougher decisions, and they have the information to do that. So I think within that framework, it'd be better.
Maybe Sandy, maybe you can take all of them if you like, but especially the third about income share agreements, skin in the game, using financial incentives.
That's what my plan was to take that question.
I thought it might
because I am not fond of this idea. This is for when President Obama proposed a rating scheme for colleges and universities. He wanted eventually to link it to the financial aid system, and with the idea that if you gave students the incentive of you'll get a larger Pell Grant if you go to an institution with better outcomes, that then students would vote with their feet. I think this is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea because it means that you're going to end up giving less financial aid to the students who need it most, because students don't and can't make decisions in that way. If you are going to your local community college, it's not like if you hear that there's a community college across the state that has a better graduation rate or better employment outcomes, you could go there, you can't. So it just is, this is not the way students make decisions. This is not the appropriate incentive system. I think the income share agreements carry a lot of risk in this way also. The idea that if you have a higher interest rate on your loan, if you major in art than if you major in engineering, so maybe I better major in engineering. First, no one knows the interest rate on their loans, and second, we don't want people to choose engineering instead of art for this reason. Our point is you need to have adequate outcomes. You need to have a living wage, not you need to maximize your earnings. And so I think structuring a system to get students to do that is bad, and student aid is meant to provide opportunities for students who need them most, not for those who are going to have the best outcomes.
Thank you. David and Sean, did you want to pick any of those to respond to? Either it's the problems really at high school, defending associate's degrees, or skin in the game?
Real quickly, I'll just run it down. The preparation issue obviously is critical, that it makes the community college have a huge responsibility that perhaps in some cases it's not fully equipped to meet at least all the demands of the students. But one thing I do want to comment upon, it's come up a number of times this morning, is that a lot of what is described as being failures, non-completers in the context of this book, apply to students who in some other ways could be said to have been served well. It's absolutely antithetical to the discussion about success and completion and graduation we're having right now, and for all the right reasons. But for some students who are very, very poorly prepared, I would posit that student is better off for having taken a couple courses at a community college than if they had not attended at all. In the absence of having other alternatives for that student, this is the best thing that we can offer those students at this point in time. And I think a lot of policymakers fail to realize that, and there's an aggregation of our almost 8 million students every fall into one data clump, and it distorts the benefits that some students or those disaggregated students. On the issue about the transfer, it's only in the associate degree is that students have to be able to transfer easily, as I mentioned when I commented they need to have that information up front. On balance, the AA degree, as has been pointed out, just doesn't buy students a lot in the marketplace. I'll stop there.
Anything from you, Michelle? Did you want to respond to
So I completely agree about the high schools failing, and I don't think it was the intention of this book to focus on solutions and interventions in high school that cover that transition period, but there is a lot of work out there and a lot of innovation to try to bridge that gap. So I think that is something we can continue to focus on. In terms of the liberal arts study, the question with the International Baccalaureate made me really think about selectivity. Those programs are very rigorous. There are certain types of students who enter into those programs. There are certain types of high schools that offer those programs. And those students being prepared in such a way makes me wonder whether they are already equipped to do better in a liberal arts program in a community college with the intention to transfer versus a student not so prepared. So I'm not sure where the causality is there.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for a couple more, as long as they're short and sharp. So let's come to the front. Go here first, and then we'll go to the gentleman 2 rows in the back and the gentleman right at the back. So we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Madison. I'm from MIT. So we've had a couple of references to challenges that associate graduates get by transferring to 4-year bachelor programs. Would anybody on the panel like to kind of expand on what those challenges are and how we can strengthen those gaps between the community colleges and 4-year institutions?
Okay, the transfers. Great. Thank you for that, and thank you for being so succinct as a model for the others. The gentleman 2 rows in the back there. Yep.
Hi, my name is Michael Melton, and I heard about your book, and someone invited me here. I kind of feel like I'm a test study for what is taking place. Growing up in single family, poor, in the projects, very poorly educated, but then you get an opportunity to go to college or junior college. You pick college, you pick a degree you're totally unqualified for, then the choices you have to make to get the degree, and then to wind up where I am right now. I'd like to talk to someone or any of you in more detail about my life experiences. I don't know if anything is like that in the book, but I'd like to offer myself up to some of my thoughts on this.
Where did you graduate from?
University of Missouri, Columbia.
Thank you. And I think there's, the gentleman right at the back. Right at the back, he's been waving pretty, yeah, so it better be good.
Hi, thank you everyone, by the way.
Name?
My name is Blake. I'm from Chicago. I go to GW. I'm a grad student in international development. My question was, kind of tied to the gentleman from Philadelphia and the gentleman here. There's a common rhetoric in Chicago, obviously, around schools and young students in high school kind of diverging off of that path. So there's definitely a problem beforehand, but a semi-solution to that has been mentorship programs. And I was curious, I didn't read the book, but if there's any emphasis on the effectiveness of mentorship programs throughout high school and throughout community colleges.
Thank you. So we have a data point offer from Michael. Thank you. And thank you for your brief story. And the questions from Madison are the importance of transfers and how can we improve them. And I think there are huge variances in transfer rates by state and institutions. So we must know something about that. And then back to this kind of point about helping up from high school and mentorship. And I think ASAP contains some strong mentorship elements. There is the replicability problem that LaShawn has identified. But perhaps take one each or divide it between you?
On the transfer question, it's very clear that there are lots of barriers to transfer, which include, some of the barriers are harder to deal with, like here I'm going to a community college because I am place-bound and I would have to go to a different place and a more expensive place in order to go to a four-year. But many of the credits don't transfer, so you lose a lot of the time. There was one study that just came out that said, actually, you think you're going to a community college to save money, but because of the credits not transferring, it ends up being frequently much more expensive. So state systems obviously should be able to do better, but they've known this for a long time, and it still doesn't seem perfect, in making a smooth transition and a smooth transfer. And so we need to make all those possibilities easier. There will still be many students who think they're going to transfer, and they don't. So if you complete an associate degree and you transfer, you have a good chance of getting a bachelor's degree. But most people don't have that happen. So we still, as good as the transfer system might be, need to make sure that people who don't transfer end up with a marketable credential.
Mentorship and/or transfers?
Well, actually, I was gonna pick up on Michael's point. What I would like to know, I think our whole field is for folks like you, what was the key to success? What enabled you to overcome those barriers? And you don't have to answer right now if you want to.
You get one sentence answer.
Okay, but if we can identify those and provide more of that, number one, in the K through 12 years, so people can try to get back on path before. And number two, what was it during the college years that enabled you? Then, if we could identify those, then we have more information on what it takes. And with that information, you wouldn't have to discourage people necessarily quite as much if you could provide more of those supports.
Can you have a go, just in a couple of sentences?
Well, part of it is that my mother told me a friend of hers had a son who got an engineering degree, and he was able to get a job. Right. And she said, so when I was graduating, she said, well, don't go to the military. Why don't you try to go to college and become an engineer? Not realizing what it took to be prepared to study engineering at an AAU university. But then the university itself never told me, well, you can't try. They didn't give me money, they didn't give me scholarships, but they admitted me. Then once you're there, you have to realize that, oh my God, if I'm going to do this, I'm not going to have a traditional college experience. It's just going to be work. It's going to be catching up on something where all of the merit students from the state go to that degree, and here you are, you don't even know what theta is. You've never seen algebra, and now you want to be an engineer. So what made the difference was I'm going to do it, and I'm going to sacrifice everything else that it takes to do it, and that was the difference. And then you don't want to let your family down, your friends down. You're going to do this, but it's really self-sacrifice once you decide you're going to make that decision.
All right, but it would have been much better if you had found out that information in the high school years.
Correct.
When they start, right? So that's...
It might not have gone then.
That's true. That's true also. If I had known how hard this was going to be, I might not have done it. But I also think that I should have been at least exposed to some mathematics while I was in high school. Some mathematics.
Yeah. So you may be a perfect story. You may also be a researcher's nightmare in the sense that you're the exception that proves the rule that they've just written a whole book about. Which is to say there's a huge variation, right? There's always going to be variance within these averages. Yeah. And I think that's the point that's really kind of come out.
And that's what the
university...
university...
be faithful to the individual stories, but also faithful to the data, right? You're an N of 1. That's a great thing. But if you've then got an N of 4,000, if you're spending public money you've obviously just got to think not just about the exceptions, but also about just as a rule, would someone like you have succeeded?
Or as I saw, is how do you measure aptitude as not being what you already know and how you're using it,
that's what we don't want to do.
versus your ability to figure things out and get it done.
So I'm going to cut you off because you're the best speaker here. So if you could stop, that would be great because you're making it hard for us. Does anybody else want to pick up on the mentorship or the high school thing? We're very short of time now, so if you can brief, that would be great. Yeah. Anything?
So I just wanted to pick up on the articulation point, the transfer point, which I equate with articulation agreements, which are notoriously difficult to do. There's been a recent book by Lexologue at CUNY describing the difficulty of just getting articulation agreements within a system. So this is a system that has both community colleges and four-year universities, and yet they struggle to do the transfer seamlessly. And I think it's an illustration of all of the factors that go into moving from one segment to the next. And if it's difficult to do in a system, then think about what happens when you have this arbitrariness between non-credit and credit, and doing that across state lines, et cetera. It's almost a minefield, and we yet set it up as if you can start at junior college and you can go on.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, unfortunately, so I'm going to invite Ron back up to the podium to close our event.
I said in the introduction that these kind of events are the bread and butter of the center that Richard and I run. I did realize how great a prediction that was. You start with a strikingly original book by great authors that have a tremendous background in the topic. You have great reactants to bring all sorts of issues, and you have a fabulous moderator, and everybody learns something. One of the most important things we learned here wasn't as explicit as it might have been, is if we don't solve this problem of this middle group, kids that could do well at a community college or could get some kind of certification, we are not going to have a big impact on equality of opportunity in America. We have to solve this problem. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.